first question from you, Professor, is what's the role of media in the modern society and how it's successful?
Well, there are a great many media in modern society, and they do have different roles. One of the very significant elements of modern media is professional journalism. And the dominant conception of professional journalism is from a kind of liberal Western model, where what it is intended to do is to supply society with the factual basis on which people can then judge claims made against it. So it has the very important job, for example, of distinguishing between facts and claims. Now, that's not always easy. There have been examples in the past where claims have been dressed up as facts, and the media themselves have been implicated in making them appear to be factual, such as, for example, Iraq's weapons of mass destruction. And that caused a very great deal of confusion in, I think, a very harmful way. But there are equally later examples of where facts have come under pressure to be regarded instead as claims. Here in Australia, there has been significant pressure to downgrade the facts about human-induced climate change, for example, to make them regarded merely as claims instead, and requiring to be balanced with an equal or opposite claim. There is a persistent tendency to reduce the status of the facts about Israel's illegal military occupation of Palestinian territory, and to regard that as a claim to which Israel must have a right to reply. And so journalism has the very important job of maintaining that distinction, and that's how it can play a role in enabling people to engage in an informed way with matters of common concern in the public sphere.
So you just mentioned about the mass destruction and weapons in Iraq. So what are the source? What kind of thing actually makes media to report some disinformation and give people wrong information? What are the sources?
Well, professional journalism in commercial or corporate media in Western societies, which is the dominant model in the world, or at least it has been, they report according to a number of predominant conventions which arise out of their own economic and political interests. So, for example, we have the Sydney Morning Herald. Now, the Sydney Morning Herald wants to sell as many papers as possible to people all over Sydney. So what it tries to do is it tries to have a news agenda which is about things that everyone can agree on. Now, people may disagree with the way it reports things, or they may disagree with things in its leader columns, but the front page story is intended to be accessible to everybody, people of all political views and none. Now, what that means is that it has implications for sourcing. The Sydney Morning Herald might decide to lead its front page on something I say, a professor in university. But the thing is, even in Sydney, there are thousands of professors in universities, or at least hundreds, so why should they choose me as opposed to any of the others? Whereas, if they choose to lead their front page with something that the state premier has said, there is only one state premier, and it's not the newspaper's fault that that person is the state premier. So it appears to be something uncontroversial. That decision appears to be something uncontroversial. It appears to be, it's a choice, but it appears not to be a choice. And that's a very important factor in commercial news gathering, journalism in commercial news gathering, because it enables people to buy the paper who hold all political views and none. Now, that means that there's a kind of hierarchy of sourcing, with officialdom in various guises always at the top. And people know that, and people can exploit that. So in one of the most notorious cases, the reporting of Judith Miller in the New York Times, for example, she was directed by people in the CIA, the American CIA, to sources including people like Ahmed Shalabi, who was an exiled Iraqi political activist, who supplied all this information about intelligence supposedly coming out of Iraq, that it had all these weapons of mass destruction. And the reason why that got into the paper was because it came in that familiar pattern from officialdom. Now, the problem is, of course, she didn't do enough to question the information being given by those sources, or to juxtapose it with other versions of the same event, and that's why it's ended up being so misleading.
So you mentioned before about the Sydney Morning Herald. So all we know there is a big controversial topic in Australian media about the Mike cartoon. So there was a big response of Australian society to Mike's cartoon, and Mike resigned, and also probably the Sydney Morning Herald face 18C Act. So, but the other hands, there is other cartoon in Australia in the Australians newspaper on 31 July. So this was as strong as it was Mike's cartoon, but the Australian people's reaction was not as strong as it was against the Sydney Morning Herald. What is your opinion about that kind of difference viewing of people from media?
There are many layers in the Mike Carlton affair. First of all, Mike Carlton broke a cardinal rule, well known to all of us, such as myself, who try to draw attention to the Palestinian version of events or Palestinian claims or rights or freedoms in the public arena. That is, that Mike Carlton abused the public. Now, another person in another context for another newspaper might get away with that. But if you decide to take on the issue in the way that Mike Carlton did, then you expose yourself. And when you've exposed yourself, you can't afford to then abuse the public. So that's the first point. Second point is that there is a yawning chasm here in Australia between public opinion about the Israel-Palestine conflict and stated or professed political opinion on the other hand. In its political stance, Australia is right out on the extreme pro-Israeli fringe of world political opinion. And given some of the statements made by government ministers lately, Australia might even be on the extreme pro-settler fringe of Israeli public opinion, or political opinion. But on the other hand, if the Australian public are asked, as they are now and again by professional pollsters, for example, do you favour the Palestinians having their own state? Then a large majority say yes. So Australians can grasp the essential fairness issues of this, but it doesn't translate into political process, and it's worth asking why. Now, there are many answers to that question. One of them was supplied by Bob Carr, the former foreign minister, talking about the power of an extreme right pro-Israel lobby operating out of Melbourne and through the office of the then Prime Minister. So there is interference, and I would say even political corruption behind the scenes going on in order to sway Australian political opinion away from the Palestinian case and towards the Israeli. That's ongoing all the time. That's an essential part of the background to what happened to Mike Carlton.
Politicians, what actually politicians want from media, from your perspectives?
Well, politicians in a polity such as Australia are well aware that they need to govern through and with information, because that's the only way in which they can take effect. You can make or devise all the laws you want, but unless people are willing to carry them out and respond to them, then your power is extremely limited. And it's certainly the case now, for instance, that by the time, let's imagine, a minister is announcing a new policy, the minister will rise to her feet or his feet in the House of Representatives to talk about it. By that time, the meaningful debate over it will already have taken place through the media. So the media is the space within which power is decided. That's not to say the media themselves have power independently of anyone else. They have power by virtue of of overlapping with other power structures. But it's the space within which power is decided. And therefore politicians, every move they make, every policy they adopt, every strategy they try, they all have to be media policies and media strategies. So they have to have a communications element built into them. And that's not something they, are necessarily very happy about, but they are all well aware that it's unavoidable.
So back to the first questions. When something is wrong and they actually give people false information, what are the effect for the people from media?
Well, media effects can be conceptualized in many ways, but one very powerful tool for beginning to think about media effects is framing. And one of the most influential statements of framing theory was by Robert Entman, an American academic, about 20 years ago. And the crucial thing is that it links problem diagnosis with treatment recommendation. So if readers of a newspaper or audiences of a television program, or now people who follow a Facebook page, for example, or have their own Twitter account, if their attention is continually being drawn to a particular problem which is presented in a particular way, such as to be diagnosed as a problem, then they will inevitably be able to be mobilized behind a treatment recommendation to match. So terrorism is a good example. Okay? One of the main ideological statements of the war on terrorism was by Richard Pearl, who was a leading neoconservative in Washington, who said once, "We must decontextualize terror. Anyone talking about the roots of terrorism is simply trying to excuse it. Instead, it must be fought and destroyed." And that's a crucial link, because if you report on or try to understand a terrorist bombing, for example, without understanding the context for it, without trying to inquire what it is that might have made these people do this, then you can't have anything to fix. There is no opportunity to intervene in the cycle, except to react after the event with more violence. So the way the problem is diagnosed affects how people are able to be addressed with particular treatment recommendations. And that's how the war on terrorism was made into an effective political appeal to electorates around the world. Remove the context from the violence, it appears that more violence is the only solution.
In Australia, there is any other controversial topic, and of course it's about the asylum seekers. So when the coalitions took their power after the election, so for a long time they didn't release any information about the board arrival of any things. What's your opinion about that? You don't think that it's they didn't give the information to the people they should give? Or
at the moment, the coalition government is having a huge struggle to sell to the Australian public a budget which is full of unfair and unjust regressive measures. And Joe Hockey telling us that impoverished Australians do not drive is just one example of that. And the problem for the coalition is that that is a political ground on which they will never win, because fairness is a theme of the opposition Labour Party instead. So what they invariably do is to try to change the subject and stop us thinking about fairness and justice, and instead get us to think about security. So hence we have these new terrorism laws suddenly cropping up in the debate, and the other one is asylum seekers, or as they call it, border security. And that is the only reason why asylum seekers have any salience in Australian political debate. They are tiny in number. Their arrivals are in a society which has been probably the most successful in the world in integrating new arrivals into a host culture, and we have nothing to worry about and nothing to fear from accommodating more of them. The only reason they're made into an issue is to distract people's attention from issues of justice and fairness. And the big one is, why is it that we are a society awash with the proceeds of mineral wealth, and yet we are struggling to pay for our public services? That's the big injustice.
So my last question from you is, what's your suggestion for media drivers?
Well, we are now in an age not merely of mass communication, but also of mass self-communication. That's an observation made by the sociologist Manuel Castells. And therefore we have an opportunity not merely to consume media, but to be the media. And we do have to make use of all the tools at our disposal through social media, blogs, the proliferating in Australia independent media sector. We have some very good websites which have done some very good journalism, such as New Matilda and Crikey, for example. And they have to be strengthened because they are supplementing the dominant constructions and framings of mainstream media, which restrict public debate in Australia. We have to do that. But let's not give up on the cause of structural reform. In most prosperous Western democratic countries, there is a much stronger regime of media regulation than there is here. So in the UK, for example, you can have a commercial radio station. I was interviewed by a commercial radio station from the UK the other day. But that commercial radio station is obliged to, first of all, clearly separate news from comment, and secondly, achieve balance in the presentation of public affairs. There are very weak, if any, such regulations on commercial broadcast media here, which explains the phenomenon of right-wing talkback radio, with shock jocks drip-feeding poison into the ears of thousands of listeners out there all the time. And that has a huge negative effect on public debate in Australia and should be stopped. Secondly, there are many countries in the world, such as the United States, for example, where you are not allowed to own media of more than a certain size unless you are a citizen only of the United States. And we should adopt that too, because Rupert Murdoch became a citizen of the United States so he could own American media. At that point, he should cease to have been allowed to own any Australian media. At the moment, News Limited owns newspapers which account for 71% of daily newspaper circulation in our capital cities. And that means we just do not have the diversity in media to enable us here in Australia to have the kind of debates we need to have to come to grips with the problems we face. Climate change is a classic example. So we urgently need media reform, but we can also outflank mainstream media by using the tools at our disposal to be the media and support independent media.
Okay, thank you for giving me your time.